G'day everyone, welcome to the first video tutorial from ZechRail in conjunction with N3V Games for Trainz a New Era. This tutorial will be covering the animation and then export and setup of a set of driving wheels for a steam locomotive for Trainz a New Era. It is using techniques that will apply to all versions of Trainz a New Era, so I am not exporting for FBX in this video tutorial, as I'm using the existing asset that is not currently configured for FBX. However, it is a good example for actually animating the bogies. I will be using a rigid animation rather than skin or physique, just for simplicity of showing the actual animation techniques. The same techniques can be used for skin or physique as animations. So for simplicity and brevity of the tutorial, it will just be a basic rigid animation. Our asset here is a Victorian Railways DD class 460 Stephenson link steam locomotive. It has inside Stephenson link. I will not be covering this in this tutorial. I'll cover it in a later tutorial, as a lot of Stephenson's link locomotives do not have these parts easily visible. In fact, they're very hard to see even on this locomotive under normal circumstances, as you can see here, but you can see them clearly from underneath. So I won't be animating them in this tutorial, but I will be covering this in a tutorial later on. All bogies should have, so for setup, all bogies should have your attachment point at the axle level. So as we can see it here, the attachment point is bisecting our axle, and the same thing on our front pony wheel. And even our leading A.BOG-O attachment, your A.BOG-O attachment and your A.BOG-1 attachment specify the rigid wheelbase of the locomotive. So A.BOG-O should be the frontmost rigid wheel, in other words the wheels fixed into the chassis. In this case it will be our front driving wheel. On diesel locomotives, articulated steam locos, that sort of thing, such as a Shay, those sorts of things, it would be the centre of your leading bogie that's fixed to the frame. So for example, it would be the pivot point. In the case of a locomotive like this, it will be your front fixed wheel, such as your front driving wheel, and then A.BOG-1 will be your rigid rear rigid wheel, so your rear driving wheel in this case. Your front pony truck or bogie would be A.BOG-2, and any subsequent bogies on the rear or other locations, if it's an unusual locomotive, would be A.BOG-3, A.BOG-4, and so on. So the first step here is to hide all of the components not related to our driving wheels. I have set up separate layers for the locomotive, attachment points, the driving wheels and the front pony truck, and they are simply hidden by clicking on the hide button for each layer. The next part here is that I will hide the Stephenson link valve gear because it's not needed for this tutorial, and we now have our basic driving wheels. One thing you do need to ensure is that you position your driving wheels correctly, so I'll unhide our attachment points here and clone the A.BOG-1 attachment. So we right click and click on clone, or you can click on press Ctrl V on your keyboard and then move that to the driver's layer like so, and we now have that attachment in here. This is done purely to make it easy to move our drivers. So we select all of the components and then deselect our point, link all of them to that point, and if we turn on the grid, I think that's views, grids, home grid, this grid shows us where the centre of the scene is. So when an item is attached via an attachment point, the centre of the scene of that item, or the origin, is where that will be positioned in relation to the attachment point. So we move our bogie to y on the 0 on the y-axis and 0 on the z-axis. This will then ensure that the bogie is positioned correctly on the a.bog1 attachment point. We can now hide. We can now hide this, or we can do it later on. It's up to you. The next step is to start creating our dummies. So the first dummy you will need is your b.r.main. Make sure you have the correct layer selected. If you don't, it will create the object in whichever layer is selected, which may be a hidden layer. Your b.r.main should be at the 0, 0 and 0 positions on each axis, and then we will name that b.r.main. This is also used by Trainz to specify the point in the scene that will be attached to the attachment point, and all objects in an animated mesh must link in some way, either through other dummies or bones or directly to the b.r.main dummy, otherwise they will not appear in Trainz, or they may appear incorrectly. The next one we need is for our rear driving wheel. Make it different size to the b.r.main dummy, otherwise it will appear incorrectly. That one we'll call b.r.wheel 1, or in this case being the rear wheel, wheel 3. And we need to align that to our wheel. Now, depending on how you've made it through your creation process, this may not have the origin or the gizmo centered to the wheel set. The best way to do this to ensure that everything is centered correctly is to make sure you've collapsed your stack, or add an editable edit mesh or edit poly modifier, and then select the element selection tool and click on the axle, and then go detach, and then click OK. We now go to the axle and then go to the hierarchy tab up here, click on effect pivot only, and then center to object. That ensures that the pivot point is sent, or the gizmo is centered to the axle, and then we just reattach our wheels to that, and now we select the cancel the attach tool, and then select the dummy, click on the align tool, and then click on the wheel set and axle, make sure pivot point is selected in both, and then click on OK. That is now aligned to our wheel set, so that when the wheel rotates, it rotates on the axle. We now link this dummy to our b.r.main using the link tool up here. Click on the dummy and then drag to the other dummy. We can then link the wheel the same way. To animate the wheel, it's really easy. We go up to the motion tab up here, open the assign controller rollout, click the plus next to rotation, and then click on X rotation. Now click on assign controller. Before we do that, make sure your scene is set to 30 frames of animation. All bogies, for simplicity, should be set from 0 to 30. Frames 0 and 30 will be essentially the same. This ensures that a good smooth animation occurs. So you actually have 31 frames, but it will be handled as a 30 frame animation in Trainz. If it is set to a different amount, click on the this button down here, time configuration, and set your end time to 30. You'll see here that your length is now 30, your frame count is 31. Your length of 30 gives you 30 frames, essentially, when being handled by Trainz. So now we go back up here, click on Assign Controller, and click on Float Expression. This allows us to enter a formula, like so, into the expression box, and for a standard driving wheel this will be 360 times sin open bracket nt close bracket. Now click on evaluate and then close, and our wheel now animates. You'll only need to do this once in a bogie like this, because we can then right click on the dummy, click on clone, call that b.r.wheel2, and then align it to our next wheel set. Because this is an existing asset, all of my wheel sets have already had the centers aligned correctly. So we can clone that one again, call that b.r.wheel1. It's best to make to use clear names on the dummies and so forth in your scene. That way, if there is an issue, you can easily track down which one it may be, simply by looking at the part that's acting inappropriately. You can use the name of that part to then track down the dummy or bone. Next steps to link each of these wheels to the dummies, and we now have 3 animated wheels. You'll note that there's no animation on our motion gear yet. The next step is that we can animate very quickly our coupling rods by just placing a small dummy here. We then select the wheel set and click this one again and detach both of the crank pins. If you don't have a crank pin, you'll need to align your dummy by hand to the center of where the crank pin would be. You can use an attachment point to help with this, so you place a point in the location. I'll give you a quick example of this. So if, as I said, you don't have a crank pin modeled, we can go into the appropriate view and then move the point until it's as close as you can get aligned with where the center of the crank pin is. And then we align our bone to this, or if you have a crank pin modeled, you align it to the crank pin. It helps to, when you do this, you select the center option, and that will ensure it aligns to the center of the crank pin rather than the pivot point. The pivot point would still be that of the original wheel set, but that's not an issue. I recommend that for your actual motion gear that all of your dummies be placed a distance off the wheel set, so in this case we'll make it 1.5 meters. This just makes it really easy to see them if there's any issues, or when you have a lot of intricate valve gear, such as on an outside Stephenson's link locomotive or a Walschaert's locomotive or anything like that. So the next step is to name this dummy b.r. coupling rod left. We then link a coupling rod to it, and then link the dummy to our driving wheels dummy. This ensures that our coupling rod is animated based on the animation of the driving wheels. It will follow it correctly and smoothly. We then open the hierarchy tab again, go to link info, and we just turn off the inherit of the rotation, which will ensure that our coupling rod stays horizontal. It will follow all 3 driving wheels correctly. If I turn those back on, you can see that the coupling rod just spins around and it doesn't do what it should do. This way you don't have to manually animate these components. That one's already detached, so we can just clone this dummy, call it b.r. coupling rod right, and then align it to that crank pin and set it to 1.5 meters out to the side. You may choose a different value, that it's completely up to you. That's just a nice easy value to work with. It will already actually be linked to the wheel dummy. All you need to do is link your coupling rod to it. So we now have 2 fully animated coupling rods. Don't forget to reattach your crank pins if you did detach them, otherwise they'll get left behind. So there we have it. The next stage is somewhat more complex. You will need to animate your crosshead and connecting rod. In doing this, we start off by creating the dummy for our connecting rod. So again, you use your crank pin as your start point. We create a new dummy for it. Connecting rod left, and align it to the center of the crank pin, and then set it to 1.5 meters. Our second dummy is for what's called the little end bearing or pin on the crosshead. The crosshead's what holds the piston rod in alignment and connects it to your connecting rod. So the easiest way to do this, if you don't have the pin modelled, is again to use a point. In this case, the point is also needed for the actual animation, so we'll go ahead and create it anyway. And just to make it easy, again, I'll align it to a part of the crank pin, in this case the bolt head. And we'll set it to 1.5 meters. That way we can align our crosshead left dummy to that point. Again, we'll reattach the crank pin and the bolt head, and we'll link our crosshead to our crosshead dummy. Also link this point that we've created to the crosshead dummy, because that will be used as our guide for the animation, and then link the crosshead dummy down to our connecting rod dummy. That way the movement of the crosshead is directly tied to the movement of the connecting rod and the crank pin on the main driving wheel. Again, link our connecting rod dummy to the matching wheel sets dummy, like so. And if I animate it now, it won't act quite the way we expect it. Just like the connecting rod here. But that's a good sign. That tells us that everything is linked, hopefully the way we want it. The next step, which may seem a little bit unusual, is to actually create a horizontal line, and we'll manually align that to the angle of our piston rod, or the piston rod or the crosshead. The one thing to be aware of here is that on a horizontal locomotive it will just be a horizontal line. On a locomotive with inclined cylinders, as this one does, which is our most complex version of this animation, it takes a little bit more time to set up and all that, which is a good example. We will need to manually set the angle of our line. So we just create a horizontal line here. You hold down the shift key whilst creating a line, and that will ensure it follows either an exact horizontal line or an exact vertical line. Some versions of 3D Studio Max and some programs may also do a 45-degree line, but in this case we want a horizontal. We then need to position it exactly on the piston rod, and just to avoid confusion, I'll hide the connecting rod and crosshead from the other side, and we'll then just go into full wireframe view, and we'll move it into position on the center line of our crosshead. You could also use the top, but it is much easier to use the center line because your point here is directly aligned with it. The center line of your piston rod should actually go straight through the center of your main driving wheel, the one that the connecting rod is attached to. So we'll just move this up till it's nicely on the line here. and then we need to rotate it until it sits nicely on our piston rod. The accuracy that you do this with is up to you. I highly recommend getting this as accurate as possible. That way your crosshead will move smoothly along the crosshead slide bars and not visibly jump up and down. So this is pretty good. We can see that it's a little bit out, but if I do this, no, we need to go the other way. And that looks pretty close. I'm pretty happy with that. In fact, it looks like it may just be a case of it, the whole line is sitting up above it very slightly, so we'll just move it until it's almost completely hidden, and there we have it. The next step here is to actually select all parts that we don't need for the animation, so all of the visible components, and hide them, so that when we're animating there's the least number of distractions to change what we're seeing. We then select our connecting rod dummy, turn on the auto key option for animation, and make sure that the this option here is highlighted yellow, so that our adjustments are done based on the viewport orientation. Unfortunately 3ds Max isn't allowing me to undo at the moment, so any adjustments I make will have to be done by hand, and if I make a mistake I just have to try and manually set it back to what it should be. So in this case it appears our point is sitting down very slightly, so I'll just move the line onto the point. Again, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. You're best off having your line aligned to the point, because it is simply a straight line, so this will ensure that the crosshead follows that straight line exactly. So again, we select our connecting rod dummy, and we go to frame number 1. 3ds Max will automatically save frame 0's animation when you make adjustments in other frames. So we select our rotation tool here, and we rotate until our crosshead dummy is sitting correctly on the line. One change I would recommend is to go into your preferences and then change your spinner's setting here to a precision of 4 decimals and the snap to 0.001. That way you can simply use the spinners down the bottom in the XYZ coordinates to make your adjustments and not have to type much in. In this case, all I'll need to do is a simple half the increment amount, so 0.0005, to bring it perfectly onto the line. Again, I do stress that I recommend that this the animation here is very important, and you get it as accurate as you can. Even very small movements can be very noticeable on some locomotives, so just make sure you're getting it as accurate as you can, or as necessary for your locomotive. So that's frame 2 done, and we just continue doing the same thing for all 30 frames. So sometimes you might find that it's exactly in the middle, as I found on a few frames here. It's not a big issue, because again you can type in the value. There is a bit of zooming in and out so that you can make sure you're where the yep, there it is. So you can make sure that you're where the dummy is going to be. It's generally easier if when you're working from the right view on the left hand side components to go a little bit above the line. That way when you have to type in a value like that, it is a positive value and it's a little bit quicker to type it in. You're not having to worry about entering a decimal, a negative. Just for ease of access, I have put in some time points in the description below this video that will allow you to skip to the end of this segment, because I would expect most of you now know exactly how I'm doing this. But you can keep watching if you wish to. But if you would like to skip it, just click the time point below and you can then follow the rest of the video. I will only be doing one side of the animation in this video. The other side's exactly the same steps, it's simply on the other side. But I will be covering after this the export configuration and then getting the bogie into Trainz. And there we have it. That is the completion of our connecting rod animation. So I'll just unhide all the components here, because there is one more step left to do for this side of the locomotive. So as we can see, the connecting rod is now moving correctly, although on frame 10 we appear to have a slight drop. So we can go back in and just readjust for that frame. So that looks pretty good. I'll just double check for any other frames like that. Doesn't look like it does. There's two more things that need to be done here, just to make sure it all works correctly. First is to select our b.r. crosshead left, go back to the hierarchy tab again, and just untick the 3 inherit rotate options. That way our crosshead remains level or at the correct angle, and just runs straight back and forth. The other thing is that by default 3ds Max imparts a slight curve to the animation in the curves editor. So we just select all of the time points or frames along here and set tangents to linear. This isn't necessary for Trainz, but it does ensure that the animation works correctly in 3ds Max. If I didn't do this, our crosshead and connecting rod would dip to about here when we move from frame 30 to frame 0. It just makes it look nice within 3ds Max. We just need to relink our driving wheel here to ensure that it still animates. And there we go. As I said, I won't be covering the animation of the other side, but I will show you how to set up the dummies just quickly. So again, we detach our crank pin down here. Make sure you don't have the link tool selected still, otherwise it will not select it. And again, we'll select our small end bolt, and we can simply clone the dummies. Even though we won't be reusing their animation, it's nice and simple just to clone them. Rename it to right, and again we align it to the crank pin and then set it to, in this case, a negative 1.5 meters from the origin. And we repeat with these two. You select both and they'll remain linked. We then select just the crosshead left 01 dummy, set it to the other side, and what we can do here is select the align tool, click on here, and we just untick the X position, and it will actually retain its existing X-axis distance. And we'll just relink this one down here and delete all of its keyframes. And if we do this, we'll see that the dummy up here spins around again. And if I link these two to their respective dummies, when it goes round, it will just spin round. But we don't need to reset the inherit on the crosshead dummy. Okay, so I've now completed the animation on the other side of the driving wheels. We can see that everything's now moving as it should. Our next step is to remove all of the guides and attachment points and so forth that we added. So, for example, we do not require an a.bog1 attachment point in our bogie. So we can hide this, we can select the two guide points that we added and the guide line, and then hide these as well. And that's our bogie essentially ready for export. The one thing you need to do is make sure you've got everything has textures applied and mapped and all that. So for this example I'm using existing assets, so it's already had all our textures and so forth applied. It is using a T-bump env material, so we've got our drivers.psd file, which is our diffuse map. This will become a 32-bit TGA file with our alpha channel in it, which is controlling the reflection intensity on the model, which I also specify in the opacity here just for simplicity. As I said, it will all become just a single 32-bit TGA file for the diffuse and alpha channel, and then our normals map is specified in the bump panel. If you're using FBX files, this would be specified as a normal bump with the bitmap then specified inside that. So that is also a 32-bit TGA file with a specular map in it. We can now export our bogie. So we go, in this case I'm exporting as an IM file as I'm using an existing asset. Export will be the same for, much the same for FBX, but there are some slight differences. See N3V's bogie animation tutorial for the specific steps for FBX export. So I'll overwrite our file here. When using IM, you must export the animation, so tick this box here, and everything basically gets left as it is there. I already have text files set up, so I'll just click No to All to overwriting them. We then have to go to our drivers asset, and in here for an IM file and an FBX file, this is important. Your kin file, which is your animation file, must be called anim.kin. This isn't exported automatically with FBX, but so you'll need to submit the asset and then open it for edit and change the kin file name to anim.kin. It must be called anim.kin, otherwise Trainz will not detect it and your driving wheels won't animate correctly. We now open our config.text file. There are two important tags for a driving wheel bogie. First is the animdist file. This specifies the animation distance for the wheels. It is basically just the circumference these days. So we select our wheel, select a point, a vertex on the tyre at the top of the wheel. So in this case, because of the way I've designed the wheel, I have edges both at horizontal and vertical, so we can select at the very top of the wheel a vertex. That gives us our radius, and we plug that into a calculator, times it by 2 to get the diameter, and then times that by 3.1415, and that approximately pi. That gives us our animdist, or our circumference. So 5.0565, and if we open our config.text, 5.0565. This can be altered slightly if you want to slightly increase or decrease the speed at which the wheels spin when the locomotive is driving. You can play around with this value at just a small amount to give the effect of, say, two locomotives of the same type but different versions having slightly different amounts of worn wheels, so that when you double head they actually fall in and out of synchronization, which can sound really good. But whilst you're learning and getting used to this, I recommend just using the exact circumference, and then you can play around with it a little bit later on. The second tag we need to look at is our direct drive tag. By default, this is set to 0 for all bogies. For the driving wheel bogies for your steam locomotive, it must be set to 1. You should only have one bogie with direct drive 1 in it. This tells Trainz to synchronize the chuff rate of the locomotive to your driving wheel bogie. For this, you should always do this with your driver's bogie. That way, like in future there's wheel select reintroduced, as there was in Trainz Classics 3, you will see everything will continue to be synced up, to be synchronized, and it also ensures that the correct speed or the correct chuff rate is used for the bogies. Different numbers of cylinders, that sort of thing, aren't an issue here. They are actually set up through the sound files and the config of the engine sound asset. So a 2-cylinder would have 4 chuffs, a 3-cylinder would have 6 chuffs, and a 4-cylinder can have either 4 chuffs or 8 chuffs depending on how it's set up. But all of this is done through the engine sound and not the bogie. So we simply just use our driving wheel bogie and set that to direct drive 1. This asset is now ready to import. So we open up Content Manager, or Trainz Content these days, and we select, in this case, my locomotive and my driver's bogie, and we import them. This will take a few moments to install, as the locomotive has a lot of textures in it, which can take a few minutes to submit. Same with the drivers, that will take a couple of seconds to submit. It will be a bit quicker. Okay, that's now submitted. We can initially go open preview asset. So here's our locomotive with the driving wheels attached. It confirms that they're at least sitting correctly, they're at the correct height, and none of the parts have been displaced, as can sometimes happen if you've set up your bones or dummies incorrectly. I'll just create a new route here. This is a quick and easy way to quickly test if a locomotive works, is to either load an existing route or create a new one and then go into quick drive and just drive it around. Unfortunately, I don't have a simple circular track on hand installed in Trainz at the moment, so we'll quickly make one. Use whichever track is in here, and then we go T4, and this is our locomotive here. So we'll go bogie test route, and then we'll load it into driver, and we should be able to take the engine for a spin. Unfortunately, there will be a script error because I've messed around with things a little bit, but there we go. We have our working driver's animation. You can see that the crosshead is moving back and forth along the slide bar smoothly, which is exactly what you want to have happen. The couple of models roll up things exactly. There's no stuttering until just smooth animation, which is exactly what we want to have. Stop. And there we have it. I hope this tutorial has been helpful. Please let us know if you either have any requests for creation tutorials like this, or have any suggestions. I'm happy to hear about any other methods that may be around. As I said earlier, I have looked at the lookout constraint for doing the connecting rod and crosshead, but it is not my preferred method. I much prefer it to do it the way I've shown in this tutorial. It just seems a little bit more consistent, and avoids some of the issues that the lookout constraint can have sometimes. which saves pulling hair out any further than you need to. And I look forward to seeing what everyone creates for Trainz.